Welcome to the Businesses Start Here podcast, hosted by David Vigliotti and Vigliotti and Associates. We're here to talk with business owners and business experts to inspire and encourage entrepreneurs.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Businesses Start Here podcast. Today we have a special episode. We have two guests with us for the first time. We have Corinne Brandon Smith from CorEats. And they're going to tell us a little bit more about their business, but I can't wait to get started. So, Brandon and Corey, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This is exciting.
Thanks for having us.
Sure. You talked. I didn't think you were going to talk, Brandon.
That's it. That's what you get.
So, if you guys, whoever wants to talk, can tell us a little bit about your business and how you got from your start to where you are now.
I'm going to let you start.
Okay. So, I'm happy to start off, but ultimately Corey started CorEats really about 3 years ago. It is her business. I've been in the background helping her and guiding her. I've built a number of businesses over my career, so I've just been a support mechanism for her to really get her on her feet and get her going.
Yeah, absolutely. The support has been tremendous, and not too long ago he officially came on as CorEats business manager. So we're rocking and rolling. But how did we start? Our journey actually started a long time ago with our daughter. Where should I be looking?
You can look at me.
Look at you? Okay, cool.
We'll edit that out.
Cool. I wanted to say it and I wasn't sure if I should or not. So, looking back, hindsight's 20/20. You can always see how everything you needed was lined up before you even knew that you needed it, right? So I had a love of food, and with our oldest daughter, when there was a health challenge, we were determined to get around that giant, and we weren't going to let it affect the quality of our life or fullness of life. So we found out that food was a really big part of her healing journey. And with that, we started thinking outside of the box because we didn't want to be limited on what we could and couldn't have. Food is one of life's greatest joys, right? So over 15 years, we got really good at developing alternative recipes, and people started asking for the recipes. And I found out that just because you give somebody a recipe doesn't mean that they can create it, right? So I found myself putting dry ingredients into baggies and then marking on it with a Sharpie. Add 2 eggs, 1/4 cup of milk, a tablespoon of oil, and that turned into my daughters just grabbing dry mixes from the freezer and making waffles or bread, or me giving those away to people, and all of a sudden people were having success. So that went on for about 15 years. There were several words spoken over me from friends and family, like, oh, these recipes are amazing, you need to write a cookbook, or you're going to be famous one day for your recipes. And I would always be like, oh, that's really nice. You're just being really nice. I'm glad you like it, but you're just being really nice, right? In 2018, I did my first fast. And when I say first fast, it was a big fast because I had never successfully done more than, a 6 to 6 for one day because I love food. But I did a 21-day fast, and it was water only except for coffee in the morning. And during that fast, this compelling came on me that, okay, now is the time to step out. You need to launch into this business, because I was sick of going to health food stores and compromising my standards, whether it be an ingredient or a taste, and buying really expensive products that tasted nasty in the name of health, right? And feeding my body good, wholesome food. And I just felt like I could do better. And I'm like, I need to get this into people's hands. People don't know what they're missing. Food is so, it's part of life, and people need to experience the fullness of food. So during this 21-day fast, this compelling came on me, okay, you've got to launch. So I went to work finalizing all 7 recipes that CorEats has today without ever tasting them. I relied on all my other senses, all of the history that I had with putting ingredients together, understanding how it should look, how it should feel, the texture, the smell. And that's ultimately how we launched.
Yeah. Were you a cook before this, I assume? Or what do you, maybe not cook, what's the term? I know there's baking and cooking are 2 different things, right? No?
No, so...
In the house, I guess, but not as a career or a job. She's a chemist, research and development.
Which people are like, oh, you're
Science
using
geek.
chemistry. No, that's not what's happening. I was a stay-at-home mom, and I came from a family where, like, we had wholesome meals, and it brought me joy to be able to put really good meals on the table. So we had wholesome meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner with every kind of snack you can imagine in between. But starting out, like Brandon said, I was in the science field. I started out as a chemist, and then that went into a biotech, and at some point I did environmental research as well. And when I had Cecily, I went on maternity leave, and I planned on going back after 2 weeks, and I never did. I became a stay-at-home mom, and all of that science went out of my head, and I don't use science to create recipes. I experience the recipe by taste as I go, and I think it's intuitive. I think it was just always in me, because good food, you can tell when it tastes good. I never followed recipes. I just kind of dumped and experienced as I went, dumped into the bowl, like, oh, that needs more vanilla. And by the time we got to meals, I wasn't hungry, because I taste my way along, and Brandon would get so frustrated with me. I got the term, they nicknamed me the picker. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Not particularly.
He doesn't want to get in trouble.
No. So, yeah.
Well, you can see even just like your demeanor kind of changes when you start talking about how you created it. So that passion is really, I think, there's kind of two thoughts on passion. One is passion that helps you get started but won't help you maintain. There's the other thought that passion is the only thing that's really needed. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, that you need to get started. That passion is going to ebb and flow at times, obviously. Like as you get, we were talking about before we got on, all the things you have to do to run the business. So you get worn down at times, and that passion kind of dips, and then something happens and it picks back up again. But seeing the passion you have, just talking about it, the excitement that you had, that's why you guys are where you are right now, where you're building such an amazing brand, I think, and it's helping so many people. So it's cool to see just like you light up as soon as you start talking about it.
Absolutely. The creativity is there. I always say that I'm a creative, and I think that every individual is actually a creative on some capacity. People like to put it in a box and see a great painter as a creative, or we all have creativity in us, every single one of us, and that feeds the passion of whatever it is that we focus on, that drives our success. Right?
Yeah. One thing I wanted to make sure we talked about is talking to Brandon. So I deal mostly with Brandon when we talk about your business, and that's what I want to talk about. So he frees you up to do the part that you really enjoy. He has kind of the business acumen, just from, like you said, you've been involved in starting multiple businesses. So tell us a little bit about how you guys work together as a married couple and kind of co-workers at the same time.
You want me to take okay. Yeah, so this is probably more of my space, but ultimately I think a lot of it comes down to, I am, at least for CorEats, doing a lot of the back office stuff. The things that are probably less glamorous and less exciting to complete, but as for a business are essential. Like if you don't do them, it's going to cause a lot of issues in the long run, right? Or create a mountain of work that will need to be completed at some point in the future. So I've kind of taken over many of those things that most small business owners don't like to do, and probably don't perceive that are required to do initially starting out of the box, such as the accounting work, things like inventory management, working with manufacturers and supplies, and all of that stuff that's like not glamorous, like doing sales and creating new recipes and
legal documents,
doing marketing stuff and creating flyers or whatever, all the social media feeds, and flying to Houston and doing video shoots with people and stuff like that. So anything that is like behind the scenes is kind of what I've put on my plate to do within this business. And a lot of that comes from I have experience, or at least I have knowledge in these areas. Whether or not I have direct experience in doing them, I have some at least knowledge of how they're supposed to operate. So, and it frees her up to do more of the items that are more exciting, right? That kind of feed that passion.
Right.
And there's a lot of things that are still on her plate, I'm sure, that are, not necessarily feeding her passion, quote unquote, but if she were dealing with QuickBooks on a daily basis, I don't think that would really invigorate her too much. So
yeah. So are there places you overlap, or you keep it basically like completely separate?
I mean, we do overlap from a cross-referencing and verification point of view.
Mm-hmm.
We do try to keep it relatively separate, like we operate within our own lanes, and then it's really just confirmation at points along the way where confirmation might be required, right? So obviously doing a small task, whatever.
Right.
Either one of us will accomplish that small task. Onboarding a new large retailer, right, from a sales point of view is mostly her side of the business, but I've been helping her with this to cross-reference and verify that we're trying to do everything appropriately as we onboard a new retailer. Would be an example where we're actually working with one another at times.
I would say that there's a lot of overlapping, because when you do a startup, you're wearing so many hats,
Mm-hmm.
right? And those job titles grow as your business grows.
Right.
And there's always this point right before you're able to bring on more help where you're adding more and more on your plate, right? Yeah. So it's I wouldn't say that it's as cut and dry as, doing the creative things and the things that you love, because there are just so many hats that we're wearing. And there's times where we're tag teaming it and we're like, and go. And we work from a home office, so it's so easy, just walk over and ask a question. And, sometimes he does sales, sometimes I do sales. When it comes to the legal stuff that is just detail oriented, I don't like that stuff. That's not my strength as a personality, but it's becoming a strength because it needs to be for me to be successful, but it's not a natural strength of mine. Whereas it's a natural strength for Brandon to be detail oriented, and it's a natural strength for me to be a creative and a problem solver. So we really balance each other out, and he has also developed that strength to problem solve and be creative as well. So I mean, there is overlap. There's obviously a lot of overlap, and especially when you're getting ready to do that level up, right? And then when you do that level up, you bring on more help to kind of focus on areas. So
how's that level up and going? I know when you first walked in, you said you're praying for more help. So I think it sounds like you're at one of those inflection points now. So how do you handle that as you grow and the tasks become more than what you can do, but before you can financially afford to bring someone on?
Well, so
you stretch yourself
you
continually.
That's
the name of the game in a startup. It's a constant game of doing more than you can handle,
right,
until you can financially, cover bringing on that additional person to take those components off your plate that are stretching you, right? And
it's where growth happens.
I've been in startups where they've done it the other way too, where they hire in front of the curve, and every time that I've been involved in a startup where we've done that, it's been less beneficial, we'll say. Your burn rate becomes so high that it really strains the sales side of the house, right? Because then sales absolutely has to perform, and if they miss or don't perform, then you're talking about letting people go and doing things that are even less fun than being stretched a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's where I've erred at times too, trying to almost to avoid pain. I try to bring people on before I need them,
right,
or before I can, and it's led to issues at times, cash flow issues, the biggest one. But I think that's a different type of stress when you're not sure if you're going to be able to make payroll, as opposed to I'm not sure I can get everything done. Right.
Absolutely, and like I said, I've been in a number of startups. Being in ones where you have concern about making payroll are way more stressful than being in ones where, at the end of the day, I will always have tasks, and this is something I've told Corey, is no matter how many people we bring on board, it's if I'm starting a business, it's my business, there's always going to be things for me to do. I'm never going to reach a point in that business where I no longer have something to do, and I guess the only time you would reach that point is when somebody comes along and gives you a big lump of cash to sit on the sideline and just watch, right? Mm-hmm. Right. But outside of that, if you're still driving the ship, then you're going to have a mountain of work to do no matter what it is, no matter how many people you bring on board. There's always going to be tasks to be done.
Yeah, I say all the time, nobody can care as much as you do if you're the owner.
Yep.
If they do, there's something wrong.
Yep.
Right.
I think that too, like, the human capacity is so much greater than we think and know. And the part of our brain that we use versus like how much brain we have is such a small percentage and fraction. The counterpart to movement is resistance, and when you realize that being uncomfortable is that place of growth, and then that place of being uncomfortable then becomes a new like level and standard of comfort. It's just moving through that, right? And in doing that, you're increasing your capacity. It's where the growth happens, and it's confirmation that growth is happening. But the finding balance, I think, is a form of perfectionism, and I think trying to hit that sweet spot is a negative thing, and realizing that it's more of an ebb and a flow. You have those seasons where you're racing, and then they're balanced by seasons where you have rest because you've pushed through to that next level. And now what was new becomes the norm, and you don't have to think about it, right? You can just do it with the experience that you've learned from that moment of being uncomfortable. I think that's a big part of it too. And then too, like, you know, there's always things, we talk about that, there's always things. So it's, you have a number of fires, right? You got to figure out what is the biggest priority, what's the biggest fire, what's going to get your attention, and then being okay with allowing the other things to go because you're focusing on the biggest priority in this moment, right? And not letting all that other stuff become a burden that weighs you down, because there's always going to be a number of fires going, right?
It'll never stop.
And I would also want to add to that, I think a lot of entrepreneurs or new business starters tend to put out the fires that they perceive as being the easiest, right? As opposed to the ones that may need the most attention as well. Like figuring out where your time should be invested is like really critical, right? Of making the business successful. Because if you're only putting out the fires that are easy for you, right? Because essentially because you like it, then things are going to become really problematic in other areas of the business unless you have somebody there to assist you to ensure that they're also being taken care of, right? And at some point it'll come to head, right?
So you don't have to be responsible for every fire. You just ultimately are, but you need to be able to figure out, it's this one that I'm good at, I'll take it. It's this one Brandon's good at, he can take it. And the key is to not avoid any fires, right? So I think every entrepreneur has been guilty of that at times, where it's something you're not good at or you don't like doing, that you just kind of put it to the side a little bit longer than it should, and then it comes up and bites you. So it's that's something I think most people are going to learn from experience than from hearing someone tell them that.
Absolutely, it is, and that's unfortunately it is true. Like, experience is probably the best educator, right? Because negative reinforcement really drills it home of what not to do in the future. No matter how much you try to tell somebody that they should be getting out in front of it.
You learn from your mistakes. So if you're not making mistakes, you're not learning. And as an entrepreneur, you're gonna make mistakes. You're gonna, and that's a good thing. If you make 1,000 mistakes, you've learned 1,000 lessons, which make you that much better moving forward. So
and some of the most successful entrepreneurs you see have failed dozens of times before you see them as successful.
Absolutely.
We had Jason Hobbs on the podcast earlier. He's a serial entrepreneur. I think he's very successful in what he does now, but I think he had 3 or 4 businesses that failed quickly. I think he still thinks he could make them all successful if he did them today. But that's how he's successful now, because he's failed. He's failed fast. He failed hard. But that's where you become successful, because you learn from those mistakes. Our goal obviously is to not go through the failures of businesses. We want to try to learn in increments instead of big chunks at a time. But either way, you're learning something. You're going to be successful the next time that situation comes up.
Which I got to inject here. One of the most valuable lessons that I've learned being an entrepreneur is when you don't know what you know, when you don't know what you don't know, you surround yourself with people who are where you want to go, and networking with other entrepreneurs really, really take the edge off that learning curve. You get there that much faster. So, surrounding yourself with people who've been there and done that, and as well as people who are on the same path as you, your learning curve is that much quicker and less painful.
Yeah, I'm a proponent of, there's formal relationships you have like that, and there's informal relationships. I like the informal ones because you don't feel like you can't ask certain questions. When you have kind of an informal relationship, you can just say, like, I have no clue what's happening here.
Right.
Here's the situation. Like, have you been through this? Oh, you have? Great. What'd you do? And it's a little bit different than some of the formal relationships.
No, absolutely.
Which both are important.
Yeah.
But for that kind of bounce things off people, I like that.
And I think that, the benefit of those informal relationships is people generally have a desire to want to help other people. Be like, oh, you know what? We did this 6 months ago, and here's what we encountered and what we found when we went through that process, right? And sit down and have a 15 or 20-minute conversation with somebody and hopefully avoid a negative situation, right? Because maybe you had a bad outcome from doing something very similar.
Yeah,
so
that happened to us last month. So EJ, who's behind the camera here, is our office manager. He went to a conference. We changed our tax pricing with a subscription model, and he was sharing that with some people, and people who've done it before were like, you guys need to talk to us before you do too much more. You need to talk to us. We're working on meetings with them to set up, because they told us we're still not charging enough, which you guys probably don't want to hear, but they just said here they're going to lay out all the pitfalls that they ran into, because they don't want other people to go through things they went through. And also kind of a rising tides lift all boats scenario.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, you do get to a point sometimes where you don't want to necessarily help your competition out. But I'm certain I've mentioned this to you. There's more than enough people that are interested that me helping out a perceived competitor is, if that's what's going to make my business or break my business, then I'm probably not in the right market space. I need to get into a market space that's where there's lots of opportunity, and there could be 10 of us out there fighting for the eyeballs and the individuals that are interested in what we're trying to do. So I think, you're right. Like, helping out a competitor has value, even if they're not a direct competitor.
Right. Yeah, and especially in your market, like, it ultimately comes down to, does the person like the product? Have they heard about it, and do they like it? So that's really, whether you help the competitor or not, the customer is going to go with the one they like better.
Absolutely, yeah, and this goes back to it. Our strategy is solely based on eyeballs, right? Like, how many people can we get the product in front of? Right. And the more people we get the product in front of, the more successful the company will be over time. Yeah. Right? So we're not necessarily fighting against, I don't know, Duncan Hines or whoever makes baking mixes out there in the world. Right. It's really fighting against the people that don't know, right? Like, we have 99.999% of Americans don't know what CorEats is, and we need to figure out how to get them to know what it is.
Right. Yeah.
So.
And I will say it's delicious. You've given us some, and it's incredibly good. You wouldn't know it was healthy for you. So.
And that's what keeps me going.
Yep.
I want to get this product into everybody's hands. I want this business to grow to the point that it's a solution that's available to everyone.
Yeah.
So that's exciting.
Yeah. So I want to go back a little bit. So we talked about growing yourself and doing more than you thought you could. We talked about, before we started, about time management a little bit. So I think we have kind of different modes of doing it that we talked about. So why don't you share, and Brandon might have a different way of doing it as well. So like maybe between the three of us, we can just talk about like the different ways that we kind of manage our time or get tasks done.
Do you want to start?
No, you start, because mine's way more complicated than yours.
Brandon has a lot on his plate, and I feel like he just kind of bulldozes through. For me, becoming more detail-oriented has been huge, because I'm not a detail-oriented person. So it's important to have a plan. But I've come to realize that each day there are so many new tasks that come up that I have to give my attention to the biggest fire and be okay with, letting the rest go. It's kind of a juggling act, really. But then also, like, taking the time to really break down where I'm spending my time and trying to compartmentalize those into days so that I don't feel as crazy is something that I've learned to do, and I'm still actively walking out. So, setting a day aside for, to do marketing and sales, setting a day aside to do videos, setting a day aside to do recipe development, setting a day aside to meet with the team and make sure everybody's on the same page, and compartmentalizing that way will give you structure so that you don't feel overwhelmed and feel like everything's just kind of out there screaming at you and you just don't know which way to turn. But then also realizing that with that structure and with that plan, there's mobility and things change from day to day. And having that flexibility of not having that spirit of perfectionism, like, oh, I didn't follow this exactly, so I failed.
Right.
Well, no, this is what I succeeded in today, and I did it really, really well. And then getting back onto that schedule and having that flexibility.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Getting to the end of the day and you're like, I don't know what I did today. Sometimes it's a good thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, there have been so many times I go home and I'm like, I don't know what I accomplished. But
You
it's
just
because
know
I was
you're
on the phone
working.
with clients all day. Like, yeah, some days you're just going to have to plow through it.
Yep.
But I like that compartmentalizing because your brain doesn't like switching between things. So if you can kind of keep things in the same quadrant, it's not as much switching back and forth through your brain.
Yeah, and your work becomes way more efficient. Because if you take like a half an hour to an hour to really get in the workflow, then all of a sudden you're really producing good quality very quickly, right? But when you're switching back and forth, you're creating a lot of drag time for your brain to catch up with what it is that you're actually focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Brandon.
What, you have something to say?
I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying, but my compartments just end up being a lot smaller. So, I mean, outside of CorEats, I have a day job, right? So I do healthcare sales as my day job, which takes a significant portion of my day as well. I also have a couple other companies that we're running or starting right now. So, outside of CorEats and outside of Corinne, so there's always a lot of different drags and pulls on my time. And I would say that I do try to focus on a particular task, but spending more than say 2 hours a day on a given task, I don't have the flexibility to do that, right? So generally for me, I would say I'm probably a little more disciplined when it comes to, thinking ahead about what I'm going to accomplish. So generally, I will look the night before at my calendar, evaluate what meetings I have on my calendar that I've got to be like present for, and then what meetings I got to be like really present for, like actually engaged within. Because I have a lot of meetings on my calendar where I don't necessarily need to be engaged, but I'm, present because they may ask me some random question. So I evaluate that, and then I try to work my things around that need to be completed, right? And there's certain things that you can't move, right? That absolutely have to be done. Like an example would be payroll, right? Like I can't just like be like, I'll shove payroll off and we'll just do that next week. Like it has to be done on a particular day. Otherwise that impacts other people's lives, right? So, it's really looking, and I try to be really disciplined to do it the night before. So when I wake up the next morning, I have a pretty good idea of what I want to get accomplished that day, right? And what tasks that are on my list. Now, obviously, I will be sabotaged throughout the day with things that will come in that will distract me from my time. And, dealing with those moments of sabotage can be difficult, but, you just work through them. So it's similar, but it's so much more fragmented in my space that I'm working in right now.
Yeah. So I know one other business. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Joy Bean?
So Joy Bean is a coffee company that it started under Metanoia Missions International, which is a missions organization mostly focused within Nicaragua, but also the Dominican Republic. And they started Joy Bean for the local farmers in Nicaragua was essentially why they started it, to give them a resource or a source to sell their beans to. As it grew within Metanoia, they kind of just turned it into its own coffee company, so they were sourcing beans from all over the world to create coffees and distribute them. a lot of what they sold was into wholesale, so churches that were buying coffee. There's a number of hair salons. I'm not sure exactly why, but there's a number of hair salons that buy coffee from Joy Bean as well. There is an online presence where they have people buying directly from Joy Bean. But I don't know, it was about a year and a half ago, Metanoia was interested in taking Joy Bean out of the nonprofit missions organization, because there was always a struggle of how do you put money back in. So money comes into the 501c3, it was 501c3, yeah. 501c3, and then how do you actually use that the funds, the revenue from Joy Bean to put back in, as opposed to using it to feed the hungry children of Nicaragua, right? So there was always this balance of like, how do we actually build a business within a nonprofit that makes sense? And I know the individual that started Metanoia, so we were discussing about moving it outside of Metanoia and creating it as its own company. So last year we took it outside of Metanoia and created its own LLC, a partnership LLC, to start selling coffee, essentially the same thing that they were doing before, but as opposed to being within Metanoia and under that structure, now it's its own company that's running on the side. And it's still, the mission's still the same, where they're using the proceeds and giving directly back to Metanoia, to feed hungry children. But now we have, an actual balance sheet where we can say, okay, here's the money that's coming in, here's the money that's set aside for Metanoia to support that mission. But now we have actual revenue that we can take and we can put back into the business to grow the organization.
Right. Yeah.
So.
And another, I've had one cup of coffee in my life. I didn't like it, so I didn't have any more. But my wife loves Joy Bean coffee.
It is very good.
The only thing she drinks now. So.
And I would say probably what makes it better than most other coffees that you'll find out there is that the way we deliver to our retail customers, like from the website, is essentially you place your order, they roast the beans and then ship them right to you. It's not like it's sitting in a warehouse waiting to arrive to you. Essentially, your beans are roasted a handful of days before you actually get them in your hands. And that's probably why the taste is better. It's just because it's so much fresher. When it reaches you, it's not like traveling around the country and landing on a grocery shelf and sitting there for 2 months. Coffee really has a shelf life of like 2 to 3 weeks max. I mean, they put much longer on there. But for the actual flavor profiles for the different coffees that you're going to source, it's like 2 weeks is like from when it's roasted is when it really starts to drop off on its peak. And I'm not a huge coffee snob either. I'm just regurgitating what the weird coffee guys have told me. So.
Well, I am a coffee snob, and I can tell you that one of the things that we have not marketed that we are going to start marketing is that the origin coffees are non-GMO and organic. And there's a lot of coffees out there because of that shelf life that have sat around that have issues with mildew and mold, and it ties into your health. And I most definitely noticed a difference between fresh coffee and coffee that sits around because it affects your body differently. So with Joy Bean, you're getting the absolute freshest, best quality coffee. And it's also coffee with a purpose. You're doing what you do every day anyway, but you're helping be a solution to a problem in our world and helping feed hungry children and giving families a resource to make money, right? So not only are you doing feeding stations, but you're also giving families a trade, right? So that they can pull themselves up and out of the situation that they're in. So it's just such a phenomenal company.
And then I think just one more thing I want to talk about. How has your faith impacted your business?
Huge. What I love about the hand of God is that He raises a man up out of obscurity and puts him into a place of power and influence, and I've most definitely seen that in our journey. And for me personally, the way my faith has impacted what I do is, oh my gosh, there's so many ways. so many ways. But currently right now, just like being Holy Spirit led, because we've been talking about time management, we've been talking about fires, we've been talking about where your priorities are and making decisions, and being able to be led by the Holy Spirit is so important because he cuts out all of the noise, all of the busyness that would have you like, okay, what's my next move? And you just know by your spirit, man, okay, this is where I'm going to go. And it's where you're supposed to go, right? The connections that you need are always there before you need them. Being led by the Holy Spirit cuts out, wasted time and even the burden that you carry. For me, because I've been stretched with the time and the things that I'm doing, it's really easy to get in the flesh and start carrying that burden because you see so many things. And I very much so have come to the place where I just have to completely surrender and be like, okay, Holy Spirit, what is it that I'm supposed to do today? And then no matter what that is, I'm letting everything else go, and I'm going to do that with excellence, and I'm not going to carry that burden. And then the supernatural just starts happening. Things just start falling into place. So you get this advantage of being able to cut out all of the burden and all of the excess if you stay in the Spirit, right?
That's awesome.
But anyhow, go ahead. I'll let you.
No, I don't know. I mean, like you captured everything really well. I mean, it is, one of the things that I've looked back over my career. It's amazing at, how much I've been able to accomplish and the trajectory I've had by just being kind of in the flow, like using my faith as a guiding post, right? And ensuring that I'm trying to do the most honorable thing as well from a business point of view, and ensuring that I can rest well at the end of the day, right? Knowing that I wasn't doing dishonorable things in business, because there's a lot of people that are less than honorable when it comes to business, and I try to be as upfront and probably overly fair most of the time when I'm going about it, and I really do use my faith as a guiding post in our walk.
Yeah, I find it. So we were somewhere last night. People were parachuted in. So I kind of find that the Holy Spirit's almost like the wind of the parachute, right? So like you have to direct yourself where to go, but the wind eases you down.
Yeah.
So kind of it really leads you in the right place, but you just have to follow it and put your sail in the right direction. So,
Yep.
Well, I think too with that, just action, like it pleases God to do good things for you, right? So when you take that action and you take ownership of it and you start moving, then you give him something to come in and bless, right? And then when you're in tune with his voice and you listen to what he's guiding you, then he'll cut out all the heartache and the burden that comes along with the action that you're taking. So it's just it's supernatural, and it's so good. It's so good.
Yeah, I would say this loops back to one of the things you guys said at the beginning, and I was just listening. Is action is super important. Action isn't easy, right? Both from people tend to be complacent, or I don't know if you want to use the word fearful about moving out into the unknown. Right. So there's always that overcoming that initial inertia to start moving in some direction. And
getting uncomfortable.
And then when you start moving, it's not going to be easy, right? Like every day you're likely going to encounter something that you hadn't done before, right? If you're starting a business. And every one of those things that you encounter is something you're going to have to push through, right? You're going to have to either figure it out, you're going to have to make a mistake and learn from your mistake, have a victory, but it's not, you're not going to just know all of the steps until you actually start moving, and that movement is not easy. And I think most people, that want to start a business want it to just like
feel good.
Just, I am just blessed with this idea, and now I just go and everything's handled. Like it's a battle every day to continue moving forward in the proper direction, right? And know where you're going.
But the reward is amazing. So I mean, we're talking about not feeling good and getting uncomfortable, but it's knowing your faith, knowing that it's going to be good, and if it's not good, it's now over, and that you're going to keep moving, because that counterpart to movement is resistance, which means you're going to feel uncomfortable, but God's already given you everything that you need to take down that giant, and then once you do, you lead others through, right? And on that note, I would say too, like for me, I've learned that anything that causes fear is the door that I'm supposed to move through, because fear wants to shut you down and wants to keep you from moving forward and wants to steal, kill, and destroy, right? So I've learned anything that causes me fear or makes me uncomfortable, that's exactly what I'm supposed to do. And then when I start stepping through that, then God comes in behind me.
Yeah. It's amazing how you get comfortable with being uncomfortable when you start a business. Like, it's just, my wife and I talk about it all the time, like, the things that don't even show up on our radar now, that 4 or 5 years ago when we started the business would have had us running for the hills.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
See, and for me, and this is just a me characteristic, I can't say it's for everybody, I like that sense of like pushing through and having, essentially constant chaos, right?
Right.
That's the environment I thrive in. I know most people do not. It's something that I've worked with Corey over the years because she struggles with this. But I when things are hard and there's a lot going on, that's like the best case scenario for me, because I know that's where I'm learning, I'm growing, I'm figuring new things out, and we're also moving forward, right? Like, we're making progress. When things are like quiet and calm, it seems boring. I don't know.
And that's how we balance each other. The ebb and flow, right?
Yeah.
We do navigation.
So you have seasons where you push and you have seasons where you rest, because you got to take care of your flesh, or you're going to burn yourself out, right? And having the wisdom to know the difference between those two things, when you should be pushing and when you should be resting, that's something that comes with experience and time, and you learn by doing.
Right.
So.
Anything else you guys want people to know about starting a business?
I don't know. I think we touched on. There's
Start
so much
moving.
more. We can
Start moving.
Start moving is the most important thing,
Yep.
right? Most people they're complacent to not move, or fearful to move forward, right? And failure is not the end, right? So you can totally fail, like the other individual you mentioned. You can have a number of significant failures, right? But all of those opportunities are opportunities to learn, and as they had said, if they went back and did it now, I probably would tend to agree with them that market influences sometimes play a role into it, but generally speaking, you self-sabotage, right? Based on what you don't know, right? And if you learn from it, you could go back and be like, if I just shifted a little bit in my direction, we could have been way more successful at this. But moving is probably the most important thing out of the gate. Is just like, if you have an idea, start moving and doing something with it.
Yeah, growth is in the movement, and as you move, you grow and you learn. And having it's similar to having children. God gives us babies as babies so that we can grow with them, right? Can you imagine just getting like a 17-year-old and being a parent? Like, no, because
that's happened to us.
Yes, well, you can imagine that.
It's a lot of
fun. Anyway, but the same is true with the business. If I knew some of the obstacles that I would have faced before launching, I would have never launched, because I would have thought that's not for me. I'm not there. I don't have the skill set for that. But I got everything that I needed before I actually encountered that issue, and I learned how to manage that. So moving forward, they say firsts are barrier breakers, right? Yeah. When the first domino falls, that's a barrier breaker. You really feel it, but then the rest just fall by themselves, right? So the beauty's in the movement, the growth is in the movement.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Thanks, guys. We appreciate you coming out and telling us your story.
It was so much fun. Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Well, that was another episode of the Businesses Start Here podcast. Thank you so much to Corey and Brandon for such a great episode. We really enjoyed having you guys here. Thanks again. And to all of our listeners and viewers out there, if you have any topics you want us to cover, we would love to hear from you about just ideas you have that you want to hear us talk about to help you grow in your business. So until next time, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Businesses Start Here podcast. We hope you were inspired and encouraged by today's podcast. We would love to hear your feedback. Please send us an email at podcast@villiotti.com. That's podcast@villiotti.com. And be sure to share, like, and comment all of our content.